Hello, my name's David Starkey, and today I want to talk about freedom of speech in universities. But I want to do so by going back to first principles. Let me begin by telling a little story. This summer I had a very enjoyable few days at a rather grand country house party up in Norfolk. I met lots of extremely agreeable people, and one of the most agreeable was a charming young man with a very grand double-barrelled name who came from a rather grand family which admittedly had fallen on slightly hard times. He told me the lovely story that his grandmother, who had been born in the days of family greatness, had never really forgiven his father for allowing him, that's the grandson, to be born, heaven help us, in a house with a number. Anyway, this young man, who was also musical and extremely attractive, and therefore I was rather interested in talking to him, we got into conversation at breakfast. And he'd been to Oxford. I happened to say, I believe there was a thing called truth and falsehood. Some things were true, objectively. Some things were false, objectively. He looked at me as though I was speaking Sanskrit. This was somebody with an expensively fashionable education, to whom the idea that things might be true or false had never occurred. His teachers had never discussed it with him, because of course he was brought up in the world of relativity, the fact that everything is relative. It all depends. It depends upon your point of view, upon your perspective, and of course, as we all know, it really very much depends on your feelings. If you feel something very strongly, if you believe it to be true, if it's your truth, your felt or lived experience. Anyway, so true or false, this unknown notion to this charming, intelligent, expensively educated young man. Well, I was reminded of all of this by the latest storm that's engulfed our rather fraught university sector. It comes from the current frontier of the culture war, the equivalent of, the old Afghan frontier of the British Empire, where sort of obscure armies clash by night or whatever it was that Matthew Arnold said. And it takes the form of a book published by Kathleen Stock of the University of Sussex at Brighton, who is a philosopher and a feminist, and in the new formulation of the culture wars, a TERF, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. Now, please don't switch off. I'm not going to embark on any kind of discourse of these far frontiers of sexuality, as when Justin Trudeau came up with whatever it was, a list of about 10 characters, and somebody said, sexuality now involved a cat falling on the keyboard. I'm not going to do that, because what Kathleen has done is to publish a rather new and daring book. It's got a pretty undaring title. It's called, after Madonna, Material Girls. And nowadays, even the most serious academic stuff has to have some rather trashy, and what could be more trashy than Madonna at 65 exposing her bottom on American television. Anyway, some trashy pop culture reference. But the important thing about it, and look now at the cover and the title page, look at that subtitle. Why reality matters to feminism. Reality? Reality? Truth? Falsehood? Think back to my conversation with the charming double-barrelled young man in Norfolk. True? False? Because of course Professor Stock, like so many other feminists, in fact, the whole, really, of first-generation feminists didn't really very much believe in objective biological reality, that being a woman was determined by which chromosomes you had, which hormones, which genital appendages, cervixes and all the rest of it. Instead, they talked about something else. Being a man or a woman for them wasn't a matter of sex, which is indeed, any sensible person knows, biologically determined. Instead, it was about cultural norms and formation, and to deal, in other words, you were made a man and a woman, not by your genes, but by society and by society's conditioning. The idea was, of course, that fundamentally men and women, despite their biological differences, were fundamentally, for the feminist, entirely the same, and anything a man could do, a woman could do the same, or even better. Well, that was then. And, oh, by the way, to do it, you actually rechristened language. You didn't talk about sex, this thing which is biologically determined. You talked about gender, which is culturally determined. Now, gender is a very funny word to use in this context because it comes from grammar. Any of those of you who did Latin or German will be familiar that in those languages, nouns have gender. The trouble is, there are three of them. There's masculine, there's feminine, and there is neutral. And I think it's this false transfer from one subject to another, from grammar to biology, which has actually bedeviled things deeply. Because, of course, the moment you concede there is more than one gender, why stop at three? I believe the latest information from Stonewall suggests there are perhaps 176. You don't need just a cat falling on a keyboard, you need an entire herd of elephants. But that's another matter. What's happened to change the position of Professor Stock? Why does she now say this extraordinary, revolutionary thing? Reality, biological reality, matters to feminism. Well, of course, it's the challenge of the transsexual, the ex and not very ex men who claim that they're now, either by repeating a few magical words, rather like hoc est corpus in the formulas of transubstantiation, in which the Catholic priest is supposed to change the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ. You utter a few words, you declare that you are a woman, and, hey presto, wave a magic wand, and you become a woman. Well, Professor Stock says, no, you haven't become a woman. Why haven't you become a woman? Well, she dares to argue about reality. She says that being a woman, she dares to say it, is biologically determined. Secondly, if you declare as a trans person that you are a woman, what you are uttering, listen for it, is fiction. It's not true. Gosh. Well, as you can imagine, all hell, or at least all Stonewall and gay pride, broke out in the University of Brighton, as like the University of Sussex at Brighton, actually it's in Lewes really, but it's next door to Brighton. As you can imagine, the proximity created great tensions, and the tensions took the form, typically now, of a call for Professor Stock to be sacked, delivered in language which was vile, sexualized, profoundly aggressive. But it's again interesting to look at what these people were saying. They, of course, begin, and what they did actually, it was very, very carefully coordinated. There were properly printed posters that were put up in the tunnel at Falmer, which actually takes you to the university from the main means of transport of getting there. And the signs, as I said, were printed. They were really quite cleverly done. It described what Professor Stock had said, and then it said very clearly, this isn't a debate, right? Okay, it's not a debate. This isn't feminism. This isn't philosophy. This is just, it declared, transphobia, and it's not on. Sack her. Why should we have to have transphobes in the university? These students and others behind them said, why? Some of the others said, should we pay £9,250 a year, or whatever the fees are, to have transphobia thrust in our faces? They also said something else. You can't argue us out of existence. So, how do we deal with this? Well, for once, the university was relatively robust. Admittedly, there were interventions somewhat behind the scenes from Toby Young, the Free Speech Union, and so on. But eventually, the departing, and it may very well be because he's departing Vice-Chancellor, actually summoned up courage to declare that, although, listen to this, the two sides of the coin, the university believed passionately in inclusion and diversity, yet it also believed in freedom of speech. And it was outrageous that that freedom of speech and academic freedom, in particular Professor Stock academic freedom, should be challenged in the way that it was. So far, so good. But not very good. It's striking how long it took the university to come to this position. It's striking even more how little general support Kathleen Stock got. There are dozens of important academic bodies, heavily funded by the taxpayer. There is the grand British Academy, sitting in its enormously expensive accommodation in Carlton House Terrace, and doing precisely what? Nobody really is very clear, apart from enabling its distinguished presidents and fellows to parade round the world at public expense, meeting other similarly distinguished academicians. By the way, that's the only reason the British Academy was founded under Edward VII, that every other country had one, so Edward VII felt that Britain should have one too. So it's the usual business of keeping up with Johnny Foreigner. But so the British Academy said nothing. The Professor Stock is a philosopher. Her professional society said nothing. There was an even more resounding silence from the University and College Union. There was a similar silence from the Society of Authors. No professional body raised a finger in her defence. Why? Because, of course, they've all been taken over by inclusion and diversity and trans rights and Black Lives Matter and all the rest of these things. And you know what? It's impossible. As the University of Sussex, let me get this right, yes, the University of Sussex, as the University of Sussex at Brighton has discovered, you cannot, unlike Boris Johnson, have your cake and eat it. You can't, on the one hand, preach inclusion and diversity and sign the university up to trans rights, Black Lives Matter, whatever, and defend academic freedom. Because trans rights, Black Lives Matter and the rest are points of fundamental contention and debate, and they can only be debated, as Kathleen Stock has now discovered, against those criteria of reality, truth, and objective reality. Now, all this is pretty new in British universities. These kind of issues have cropped up in the way they have only really in the last 10 or 15 years. Of course, it's still worse in America. The situation has got so bad in even places, especially in places of the distinction of Harvard and Princeton and the rest of the Ivy League, that people are now actually talking about setting up an alternative parallel university system. But as always, history tells us something. And in this case, it really is the history of American academic life. And going back to, where are we now, 60 or 70 years. Because American academic life in the 40s and 50s and in the 60s experienced very similar pressures. But it has to be said, responded in a completely different and very impressive way. The pressures came from both sides of the political spectrum. In the 40s and 50s, it was the rabid anti-communism preached by Senator McCarthy. It was called McCarthyism. And there were attempts at removing anybody who was left-wing from universities, from Hollywood and whatever. Now, it's really important to say there was actual genuine communist subversion in America through the American Communist Party, through spies, through those who actually betrayed nuclear secrets to the Russians and so on. So McCarthyism wasn't only a scare, but it was spread widely and iniquitously, and disgracefully, and shocking techniques were used. And the universities developed slowly, but a proper response. McCarthyism faded and was destroyed, and McCarthy's own reputation was destroyed, and he died early. I think of drink, piously referred to as liver disease. So that was the pressure from the right. But of course, America also experienced the 60s in a much more radically dramatic way than Britain, with calls for social action. Lyndon B. Johnson, the Great Society, the need for desegregation, for alteration of public housing and all the rest of it. And there was an immense pressure then in the 1960s on the universities to become politically activist from the left. Now, the universities did address this, and did, I think, solve it. It's very rare to talk about a solution. It's even rarer that a solution actually comes from a committee. It's the report of the Calvin Committee of the University of Chicago that is delivered and printed on the 11th of November 1967. And it establishes what are known as the Chicago Principles. And if we want a solution to the culture wars in our universities now, it's quite simply, rather than the kind of legislation that's being toyed with, or the kind of ministerial interventions which are taking place at the moment, we simply need, I'm really going to sound an old-fashioned historian, we really do need to go back to the basic, straightforward principles enunciated by the Calvin Committee and summarized as the Chicago Principles. Well, what's the basis of the argument? The basis of the argument is to admit what many of the radicals say. Universities are properly places where society is criticized, radical new thoughts are thought, and orthodoxy is challenged. All of that is absolutely true. But what the Calvin Committee pointed out was that was the work not of the university, but of individual academics, scholars, and students, each one of whom had their own arguments, their own commitments, their own sense of right and wrong, moral values, which are debatable things, and so on, at an individual level. And the Calvin Committee was absolutely clear that individuals, students, members of staff should have that unfettered academic freedom, providing they don't transgress on the academic freedom of others, like those appalling students at Sussex who were saying that because they disagree with Professor Stock, or rather because Professor Stock ventures to challenge dogma with reason, to say that a trans woman is a woman, get over it, is simply dogma. It's not actually a defensible statement in terms of reason, it's religious dogma. It has to be challenged by fact, as Kathleen Stock admirably did in her book. So the fundamental principle then of the Calvin Commission is that the universities are exactly what the left, and indeed now the right, would have us believe. They are the proper places, or one of the proper places. By no means the only one. Capital cities like London are much better at it. But they are one of the places where radical ideas are generated by individual academics and students. But of course, individual academics and students can and should have wildly different views, and progress depends on the conflict and argument and debate between those wildly different views. In other words, and this will shock so many people and my colleagues, and I'm going to say it. Universities should have, the Calvin Committee says quite clearly, no values as an institution. The only value they should have is belief in truth and in scholarship and in experiment and debate as means of establishing truth. That is their only commitment. In other words, if we talk about diversity and inclusion, if we say that universities should be committed to climate change or to encouraging social mobility or encouraging large numbers of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, be they disadvantaged by race or by class, to apply by altering their admission standards, they are betraying their fundamental role. Their role simply is to be a neutral arena. The university, in other words, is not a combatant in the culture wars. It's a ring in which boxers, or it's better compared with tag wrestling, isn't it? There are many more than two, in which people can compete according to rules. And of course, not only is it a ring, it's actually got to be a referee. It has got to have the values, that sense, the values that enable all those different ideas to be contained and to discourse and to conflict, because it is conflict, in a way which is actually fruitful rather than destructive. If only we could reiterate the Chicago principles. Let me just read. By design and by effect, the university is the institution which creates discontent with existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. In brief, a good university, like Socrates, will be upsetting. But the instrument of dissent and criticism is the individual faculty member or the individual student. The university is the home and the sponsor of critics. It is not itself a critic. It is, to go back once again to the classic phrase, a community of scholars. To perform its mission in society, a university must sustain an extraordinary environment of freedom of inquiry and maintain an independence from political fashions, passions, and pressures. Look at that. It must maintain an independence from political fashions, passions, and pressures. You cannot fly Black Lives Matter. You cannot be a member of Stonewall. You cannot proclaim your belief in trans. You cannot have, I fear, class or race-biased entry. All of these things are inimical to the fundamental purpose of a university, as they are to a learned society. It is preposterous, for example, that on all of these issues, trans, Black Lives, whatever, the Society of Authors, learned societies like the one that I was thrown out of, the Royal Historical Society, learned bodies like the Society of Antiquaries that I was thrown out of, subscribe to these completely alien doctrines that have absolutely nothing to do with scholarship or freedom of inquiry or their terms of reference as established by royal charters or by their own constitutions. We need a radical shift. We need, to put it very simply, to go back to the Chicago principles, to reread the Calvin Committee's report, to read, mark, learn, inwardly digest, and to put into practice. And if we do, there will be no more disgraceful scenes like those in the University of Sussex.